It is indeed an honor for me, Your Excellency, to invite you, as the Right Honourable David Johnston, to come and speak to us on international relations.
Thank you very much, Andrew, Elizabeth, David. Protocol observed. The other dignitaries have been mentioned and underlined. I second the motion. Friends, I've come home. I'm just delighted to be here, and for three reasons. First of all, I love the university, and there's nothing I enjoy more than a gathering of university people, particularly where there's students present, and particularly the question and answer that go back and forth. I went off to university at age 18, and I loved it so much I never left. I'm on a one-year leave of absence from my law firm. And when they gave me the year's leave of absence, they say, when you've got the courage to face the real world, come and we'll teach you how to practice law. Well, I go back every year and sort of notionally remind them that I'm on a one-year leave. And I remind them as well that when I have the courage to face the real world, I'll come and they'll teach me how to practice law, and that terrifies them. The faces go white. I was at university, as I say, until from age 18 on, and I got to be age 69. I'd been a vice chancellor for 27 years, enjoying it every day. And I said, you know, before I die, I should do a real job. And they offered me this job, and guess what? It's far too much fun to be a real job. The second reason I'm delighted to be here is I learned for the first time of this wonderful association between the Canadian International Council and this council, and how treasured that relationship is. But you know, there are a number of them that bring us together in so many ways. And they're relationships that are built on trust. And trust is an old-fashioned but very important concept. As my friend, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney, says, trust comes in on foot and goes out in a Ferrari. The third reason I'm so delighted to be here is to renew an old acquaintance. When I came in at the entrance, I was introduced to David, I thought, for the first time, and I congratulated him on a splendid article he published in our national newspaper, the Globe and Mail, about a week ago on soft power diplomacy. Just a brilliant piece of work for the Canadian International Council. And he thanked me and he said, we've met before. He said, when you were early on in your time at the University of Waterloo, he was at St. John's Kilmarnock School, and I went to the school to visit, and it was David who was my host, so it's a great association. I'll tell only one hockey story, and that is in a few days' time I will go for the 50th anniversary reunion of my graduating class at Harvard. And the one thing I may or may not do is I certainly will go to the hockey arena, and I may, for the first time in 54 years, look at the West End wall. I have not for 54 years because on the West End wall of the hockey arena at Harvard are inscribed the names of all of the Harvard players who score a goal in the annual Harvard-Yale hockey game. I did, but under very unusual circumstances. It happened to my lot to start at center ice when face-off occurs at the beginning of the game in the first Harvard-Yale game in which I participated. And I must have been so dazzled by this occasion that I didn't see the referee dropping the puck. And when I got back into focus, the Yale player had passed it to his right winger who'd come in towards our goal, and from about 50 feet away, which is a long way away, took a shot at our goaltender, by which time I was back in the play. And I attempted to block the shot. As our goaltender was moving nicely to the right to stop it himself, I managed to get a piece of it and deflected it into the left corner of the net. 7 seconds gone, Yale 1, Harvard 0. And as I was coming over to our bench, trying to find a hole in the ice where I could hide, the tallest player in the team stood up and just said, "Just think, Dave, you'll get your name on the scroll at the West End with an asterisk." So I may or may not check whether my name is there and whether the asterisk is still beside it. Let me begin tonight by offering greetings and best wishes on behalf of all Canadians, and again to underline the special friendship and trust that exists between South Africans and Canada. And this is particularly so at this impressive university. As Governor General, it's a great privilege to represent Canada abroad on state visits. My wife Sharon and I arrived in Cape Town yesterday, and already we're getting a great sense of contemporary South Africa, of its great beauty, of its creativity, its promise, and its remarkable history, particularly the last 19 years. We've also had an opportunity to glimpse some of the ways in which Canadians and South Africans are working together. And we're so looking forward to learning more about our partnerships and potential for further collaboration for the remainder of our visit. But of course, Canadians and South Africans have been working together for many, many years. Malgré nos histoires, géographies et cultures distinctes, les peuples de nos deux nations ont une vision commune. Cette vision est fondée sur la diversité et le dynamisme, sur le développement de sociétés composées de communautés averties et bienveillantes, au sein desquelles coexistent la quête de l'excellence et l'égalité des chances. Despite our distinct histories, our geographies and cultures, the people of our nations have a shared vision. And that vision is one of diversity and dynamism, of societies comprised of smart, caring communities where equality of opportunity and excellence coexist. Canada, for example, is known the world over for its commitment to multiculturalism. In Canada, we strive to accommodate difference, and we proudly view diversity as a source of strength, not of weakness. As Saint-Exupéry said in Le Petit Prince, I am different from you, but because I am different, I do not diminish you, I enhance you. And here, of course, in South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, the home to 11 official languages, a truly remarkable expression of your values. Without a doubt, Canadians and South Africans both have work to do in achieving equality of opportunity and excellence in full measure. But these are the democratic values that unite us and that we aspire to live up to. As you know, the roots of our modern-day relationship were formed during a very difficult period in South Africa's history. The government and people of Canada first demonstrated their support for today's South Africa, for your South Africa, in the early 1960s, when we insisted on an end to apartheid in exchange for South Africa's readmission to the Commonwealth. And we stood in solidarity during the dark days of the 1980s, when we backed the anti-apartheid movement. I can recall conversations and public comments by our Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, in 1984, who took office, who was a great friend philosophically in every other respect but one with Prime Minister Thatcher and President Reagan. But on this one matter of apartheid and solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement, he was unequivocal. And in later years, I think his two friends from the UK and the United States admitted they were a little bit slow to see the importance of that reality. I can assure you Canadians are very proud to have, as an honorary citizen of our country, your former president, Nelson Mandela, whose wonderful portrait is just outside in the entrance. And I would like to take this opportunity to extend the best wishes and hopes of all Canadians for the continued health of Mr. Mandela. I would also want to tell you that the sugar maple tree he planted while visiting Rideau Hall in Ottawa, the official residence where I live and work, is now in full bloom in beautiful spring weather. Mr. Mandela also holds two most unusual distinctions in Canada. He is an honorary citizen, one of the few who come from away, and he holds the highest civilian order we can confer on Canada, Companion of the Order of Canada, whose motto is Desiderantes Meliorum Patriam. They desire a better country. And no one has desired a better country and done more to achieve it than Mr. Mandela, whom we regard as, of course, a proud citizen of South Africa, a citizen of Canada, and a citizen and a shining light to the entire world. And desiring a better country, of course, is a desire for our respective countries, is it not? Whether Canadian or South African, we all aspire to build better now and for the future, to ensure that our children may have even better opportunities than we do. Since 2003, our two countries have held annual bilateral meetings to discuss common issues and priorities. These talks reflect the broad nature of our relationship, touching on foreign policy, trade, development, peace and security, arts and culture, education, sports and science and technology. And as I said to your president this morning in a marvelous meeting that we had, meeting for the first time, and when I left him, I said, I believe I have made a very good friend and a friendship that I will cherish. We talked a lot about education and a lot about what I call intellectual capital exchange. And I said, you know, what I'd love to see on that annual bilateral meeting agenda each time is an item which would just read ICE, a very Canadian term, but ICE would stand for intellectual capital exchange. And how do we continue to mark our progress in intellectual capital exchange, or call it human talent development? Put simply, South Africa is one of Canada's most important partners in this vast and diverse continent. And today we stand on the cusp of a new era in our relationship, a fact that is borne out by the growing number of partnerships between Canadians and South Africans, and we heard one just a moment ago that goes back for 6 or 7 decades. Let me cite a few specific examples of our cooperation. As members of the Commonwealth, our two countries work together to strengthen respect for human rights in Africa. We've worked as partners in peace building and conflict prevention. Examples include our support of joint African Union, United Nations operations in Darfur, as well as our backing of the African Union's mission in Somalia, or AMISOM. And just this week, South Africa advised Canada that it is willing to join a working group on mediation chaired by Canada under the Malta process that addresses child protection issues in cross-border cases where Muslim law differs from other legal traditions. Sometimes we cooperate with each other indirectly through our work in different fora. Through the South African Development Community, South Africa has played a key role, for example, in advancing the return of democracy to your island neighbor, Madagascar. Canada, too, has a strong interest in Madagascar due to important people-to-people and commercial ties. Besides our own efforts, we've worked through the councils of La Francophonie to achieve the restoration of constitutional order in a country with which we have great potential for partnership. And also, like South Africa, Canada seeks to diversify its relationships in ways that knit the world together in mutually supportive networks. South Africa's participation in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represents a significant diplomatic achievement for your country. Canada for many years has had a partnership with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Canada is also a strong member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Forum, APEC, and is joining the negotiations for a Trans-Pacific Partnership. Clearly, Canada and South Africa understand the importance of building international networks in this era of globalization. And we have demonstrated this understanding through our actions. Over the past several years, Canada and South Africa have signed or made progress on a number of bilateral agreements, ranging from air services to customs to nuclear cooperation. These and other agreements and negotiations reinforce the fact that, for an increasing number of Canadians, South Africa is seen as the gateway to the African continent. Canadians and South Africans are partners in new and exciting initiatives in research, education, mining, aerospace, agriculture, food services, transportation, and energy. Another example of our collaboration, a very exciting one, involves a number of South African post-secondary institutions, including the University of Cape Town, University of the Western Cape, Stellenbosch, and of course this impressive university where we gather tonight. Yesterday I had the privilege of visiting faculty and students from these universities at the Cape Town campus. They're involved in a wonderful partnership which sees Canadians and South Africans working together in the building of the Square Kilometre Array Telescope. Though still in the early stages, this project is a symbol of international cooperation for the benefit of all humankind. The building of this telescope has drawn in a wide range of partners. It boosts our collective knowledge, has positive impact on our economies, and brings us more closely together. And it is scientific excellence at its very best, brought together by this country. It also reminds us that in today's world, new discoveries are rarely made in isolation. Rather, they more often occur as the result of collaboration between schools and research institutions, the private sector, and governments. Another great example, one that personally touches me enormously, of Canada-South Africa collaboration is our work in establishing and nurturing the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences and the Next Einstein Initiative, the next Einstein to come from Africa. This idea came from physicist Neil Turok, a South African who now heads up the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Canada, and whose father, Ben, is of course a member of the National Assembly, who himself went through some extreme difficulty as he had to escape the country after being released from prison. Took his family ultimately to the UK. Neil was educated, then taught at Princeton, then taught at Cambridge, and came to us in Waterloo to lead the Perimeter Institute. I've quoted Neil in my speeches on a number of occasions. He's a close personal friend, and he's a brilliant and humane individual. The institute he set up, aims, with the support from the Canadian government and others here in South Africa and across the African continent, is truly innovative. The aim is to help build a critical mass of scientific and technical talent on this continent, and I'm delighted to see the idea catching on in other African countries. There are already 3 such aims, plans for 2 more, and with those 5, Neil's hope is to go to 15. Peter Braid over here. Peter, just raise your hands and turn so we can see you. Peter is a member of Parliament from Kitchener-Waterloo, in whose riding sits the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics, and who worked with others to build the case with Neil to have the Canadian government provide $20 million for the AIMS program here. I do believe we will see the next Einstein or a next Einstein coming from Africa. That which is true for scientific discovery appears to so much applies to so much in our world today. A curious feature of globalization is that it both enables and requires collaboration. Working together, we help one another to develop, grow, and diversify. As Governor General of Canada, I can assure you that our country is very eager to strengthen ties with South Africa. This is true not least in higher education, a sphere of particular interest to me. Last year, Canada was pleased to host 615 post-secondary students from South Africa, and we would, of course, welcome many more, following in the precedent of Andrew, who was in Montreal studying at the same time that I was the Vice Chancellor of McGill. I constantly encourage Canadian students to study, teach, or volunteer overseas, as all of my 5 daughters have, in 17 different countries and counting. And I can't tell you how important that has been to the development of my children. I say all the important things in life I've learned from my children, but I suppose they have learned from so many others. They began going on exchanges when they were 12 and continue to this day. They began by being curious about difference, and then they developed something more than tolerance, an enormous respect for difference in different cultures, and an eager thirst to come to know those different cultures and so fit them into the kaleidoscope which makes up their own imagination and experience. Time and again in my life, I've seen how remarkable things can happen when people from diverse backgrounds and communities come together to learn, innovate, and share knowledge and experiences. The diplomacy of knowledge works on many levels, through governments, institutional contacts, and people-to-people ties. We have so much to learn from each other. Let me share with you one last example of how our respective experiences are helping us to build smarter, more caring societies, societies with keener minds and kinder hearts. I'm speaking of South Africa's experiment in truth and reconciliation following the end of apartheid. This country's innovative Truth and Reconciliation Commission was widely viewed as a model for addressing the injustices of the past while laying the foundations for a brighter future. Canadians noticed, and today we are attempting our own journey of reconciliation using a similar truth-telling commission which aims to address the historic injustices of the Aboriginal residential school system. Learning from our mistakes while seizing the opportunities before us are the means by which we can create the better world we all desire. For 2 countries situated at opposite ends of the planet, we have much to offer each other. Our relationship is politically, commercially, and culturally significant. As leaders of our respective nations, we must ensure that every one of our partnerships achieves prosperity, sustainability, and social responsibility in equal measure. When it comes to increasing wealth and well-being in the 21st century, our choice is clearly not either or, but rather and both. Canadian poet and lawyer F.R. Scott once wrote, "We grow to one world through enlargement and wonder." And he also said, I am a citizen of the world, living in the century of the mind. How apt for this time in history and for our young. Canadians are interested in learning more about South Africa and discovering its great potential, and the gracious welcome South Africans have shown to Sharon and me can be taken as a sign that the people of this country as well are ready to discover the promise of Canada. As a matter of fact, I said at our lunch that the President hosted today that we will come back, and we'll come back with 9 grandchildren. And then I had to correct myself because I remember that our 4th daughter is about to give birth to our 10th grandchild, and we expect that will be 2 or 3 days after our return home. And that's a pretty nice return home gift. Let us therefore seize this opportunity to work together for a more fair, just, and prosperous world. Merci, thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for those very thoughtful comments spanning the Canada-South Africa relationship from early on to the present and to future opportunities. I certainly, as somebody who has invested some academic interest in the relationship, appreciate those comments. But I just want to, particularly, I was also very pleased to hear you say about the Einstein Initiative and the next Einstein coming from Africa, but just allow me to translate for the audience here. By Einstein for Africa, you mean South Africa. By South Africa, you mean Wits University, and by Wits University, you mean the Department of International Relations. So, Department of International Relations, please be aware the expectation is there. I'd now like to...
It's quite wonderful that the Department of Political Science here at Wits teaches Einstein science. It just shows the two worlds are coming together.
Science is a politics. If I could now open up the floor, I know you'd like to enter into a discussion with the participants of the event, and particularly the students. And I'll give you this roving mic, because I know you like to move, and I'll stand at the podium.
Thank
so,
you.
Questions, please. And I'd ask you to identify yourself when you do stand up, so that the Governor-General knows where you're from.
On occasions like this, I usually refer to my friend Stephen Wallace. Where's Stephen over here? Stephen runs our office. I say as the brains. Don't give him the microphone yet. That's the point of my story. My story is an Einstein story, as a matter of fact. For a short period of time, when Einstein was at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, he was of the view that if only the world knew more science, it would be a perfect place. He'd probably begin in political science departments, a good place to promote that. And of course, this was very popular, so popular that he had to hire a chauffeur and a driver to take him from place to place. And one night, they were going into New York to give one of these lectures, and he said to the chauffeur, "I'm exhausted. I don't think I can go on tonight." And the chauffeur says, "Boss, I can give that lecture for you. I've heard it 1,000 times. I can give it myself. And besides, I kind of look like you. I'm short, dumpy, and I can push my hair up like that. They won't know the difference. You really think so?" "Yeah." Into the hall they go. Einstein puts on the chauffeur's cap, slumps down in the seat at the back. The chauffeur gives the lecture magnificently, so much so that there's about a minute left, and the master of ceremony says, "Time for a question." Distinguished gentleman over here rises to his feet and drives a coach and four through Einstein's theory of relativity. The chauffeur listens to this for a moment, pauses, and they said, "My good sir, that question is so elementary, I'm going to ask my chauffeur at the back to answer." Yes, sir, right here.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Mr. Jean-Pierre Lukamba, but because of Africa Week Festival and for the sake of social cohesion, my South African name is Sigusi Zunkosi. Son Excellence le Gouverneur, je tiens au nom de toute la diaspora africaine à remercier le gouvernement canadien pour une bonne politique de l'immigration ainsi que l'intégration envers les Africains qui ont choisi le Canada comme leur seconde patrie. Donc la question que je voudrais vous poser est, avez-vous un commentaire à faire par rapport à la diaspora africaine du Canada? Et puis vous êtes venu aussi en Afrique du Sud durant la semaine africaine. Donc votre visite en Afrique du Sud, c'est vraiment une visite historique. Avez-vous un commentaire à faire par rapport aux 50 ans de l'Union africaine ou bien de l'organisation de l'Union africaine? Merci.
Thank you very much. perhaps not all of you understand the question. It had to do with the relationship between Canada and South Africa, built in part on a very open immigration policy, and also built, I think, on a great respect for multicultural difference. And I think the drift of the question is that alive and well? More than alive and well. It's a wonderful foundation upon which we build so many of our relationships. As I said at the outset, that kind of exchange, that kind of partnership, that kind of shared experience really has as its root trust. And trust is something that you build preciously over time. It can disappear quickly if it's mishandled. It's very important to us that we all handle it very well, that we see ourselves as cultivators of a garden where you carefully avoid the weeds and ensure that those precious plants of civilization rise and grow in a very vigorous fashion. Using yes, Joe, other questions?
I understand you had a question over here. Is that right?
I'm Michael. I'm a student of this team, Dr. Hornsby. Talking about immigration, how do you feel the Brandon Huntley asylum incident of a few years back, which was only settled about 2 years ago, has affected that relationship?
I don't know the incident.
Where a South African citizen claimed that there was a white genocide in South Africa and he was granted asylum in Canada for a while.
So I guess I'd have to know a little bit more about the situation to provide a useful comment. I'm awfully glad that perhaps I don't know the details. Feedback?
Yes, he did claim asylum on that question you raised, and initially the asylum was seen to be successful, but was reappealed and it was not successful.
Other questions? Back here, yes, sir.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for coming down to South Africa. My name is Israel Noka. I'm with an organization called the Africa-Canada Emerging Leadership Dialogue, and it's an organization which fosters leadership between South Africa and Canada. My question is that we're very lucky in South Africa to have lots of academic institutions, but we are struggling when it comes to leadership, and Canada has produced over the last 50 years real true leaders in all ways of life. And what can you share with us that maybe we can take into the future as we start to grow, into a real powerhouse in the rest of the African continent?
First of all, my definition of leadership is recognizing your total dependence on those around you, the talents of others. And that sounds like a trite saying, doesn't it? Just have the luck to be with a good team, and of course you're a superstar. But the leader, of course, is responsible for the people around. Sometimes you inherit a team, very typically you add to that team, and it's important for that leadership to provide an environment where people are properly challenged and where they can grow, not only to the extent of their talents and capabilities, but very often somewhat beyond what they thought they were. So I think the development of leadership begins by individual leaders ensuring that they provide nests from which the eagles can fly, and that becomes a part of their everyday makeup. The other thing I would say about leadership in a society is that it was John Gardner's famous question that I referred to in my speech. Can we have equality of opportunity and excellence too? Can we see those two values or objectives as mutually reinforcing and not mutually exclusive? They can be exclusive. One can provide equality of opportunity at the lowest common denominator and squeeze out excellence altogether. But the trick is to be sure that one provides equality of opportunity in public education, for example, so that everybody in one society has the opportunity to develop their talents to the full extent. And then with that huge critical mass of talent, to try to encourage the peaks of excellence to come from it, from which true leadership comes. And the third thing I would say, it really goes back to the first point, is there's a great deal to be gained by collaboration, by being open to other people's ideas in leadership. One of my favorite bumper stickers is, minds like parachutes work best when open. And collaboration, to have that intellectual capital exchange that I referred to a moment ago, ICE. I'm so impressed with those two examples I gave, one of Ames, mathematical science at their very best, the next Einstein, and the square kilometer telescope array, where South Africa is assembling the finest talent in astrophysics and related areas, disciplines in the world. That's a peak of excellence. And those peak of excellence, I think, create at least the intellectual leadership, and with any luck, the broader leadership that goes on creating great institutions and helping the next generation of leaders to come along. Yes, sir, question here. You want my mic?
My name is Samuel Baka.
An exchange.
I'm working for the South African National NGO Coalition, Sanguku. But this question, I'm taking it out of my organization. It's a personal question based on what you have said, that South Africa is a gateway to assist, in your relationship, to assist some of African affairs. You mentioned Somali, you mentioned, I forget another country where there are conflicts. But unfortunately, you didn't mention DRC. I wanted to find out, is at international relations, the issue of, the situation of the DRC is close, or in your partnership with South Africa, you are working also to bring for peace and also the human rights situation in the DRC?
Broad question. With respect to human rights, as I indicated, we're very proud of the partnership that we've had with South Africa going back to the very, very dark days, and proud of the fact that when I'm sure many of you thought you were struggling on your own for human rights, you had another small country that was very much focused on that and attempting to exercise its influence as much as it could. And that's a natural relationship because our countries are similar in this respect. One of our great Canadian novelists once said, Canada is a nation of losers. Well, that's a bit of a startling suggestion, isn't it? By that, he didn't mean that we were people who were bereft of ambition and spirit and pride and so on. He meant that we're a country of immigrants. Our first came 10,000 years or so ago. We're very small in number. And then first Europeans and then other settlers came 400 years ago. And almost all of those people came to our country with no possessions, with no status, very often oppressed in another country, seeking freedom, with one firm desire, and that would be that life would be better for their children than it was for them. That continues to be a firm conviction and aspiration of Canadians, and I think it's the reason why human rights and democratic institutions are so dear to us, because our experience has come from so many different places where those rights, those privileges, those responsibilities were not as well enjoyed as they were. And so it's a matter of natural kinship for us to work with South Africa in peacekeeping missions and human rights missions in attempt to bring democratic values to other jurisdictions that don't have it. And it's also something in which we take great pride. Question here?
Hi, I'm David Smith of the Guardian newspaper in the UK. For a lot of conferences and a lot of articles written in recent years about Africa's changing fortunes, that economies are growing and there's a lot of optimism. Do you think people in Canada are perceiving that and talking about that, and indeed are Canadian entrepreneurs looking at Africa for business opportunities?
Well, more and more so, but certainly not sufficient for my purposes. And one of the reasons we're here with a delegation of 20 or so people from all different walks of Canadian life is to recognize the great opportunities and chances for partnership here, and then to try to illuminate that scene back in our own country. And in many ways, it's easy to do. If you look at the global financial crisis, which struck in 2008, and you look at the continent that was most resilient in the face of that crisis, it was Africa. If you look at the countries that have had growth rates that either slipped not at all during the period, or if they did only in small amounts and for very short periods of time, and are back up in the 5 to 6 to 7 to 8% level, we don't see any place in the world, with a very few exceptions, that have shown that. I think it very clearly is the decade of Africa, and we're particularly excited about your dream of Africa as a continent and the projects like the North-South Spur, North-South Spine of rail, port, etc. And those are things that present great opportunities for Canadians, and I would expect that we'll see a greater and greater enthusiasm as the months unfold. And certainly one of our specific responsibilities returning home is to cast as strong a light as we possibly can on those opportunities. Gentleman over here.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Rudy Mandio. I'm from the University of Johnston. I'm doing my honors in international relations. So my concern is more about the peace and security in Africa. So,
I'm sorry, what?
My concern is more about peace and security in Africa. Yeah. So I'm saying this because we've seen some growth in economy, some cultural change, whatever. Some business, like for example, in a country like South Africa, who is really succeeding some quite business, and also Nigeria, for example, and other countries as well. But there's no, I think for me, there's no growth or such thing, business or cultural exchange without peace. So I'm talking about this because we've got an entity or an organization in Africa called the African Union, as was raised by my friend John P. We're celebrating now the 50th anniversary. So I'm saying this, I look at the charter and their constitution about peace and security. It's so beautiful, with nice words. But where they fail is the implementation of those policies. And every time it comes about to implement those policies, we always see there's a fight, a battle between the West or external forces which come in the fight. For example, the case in Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Mali recently. So I just want to ask, what is the relation, Canada relation and the African Union in terms of peace and security in Africa? Thank you.
The first thing I would say is that we have been involved with South Africa in a number of peacekeeping missions and continue to do so, and I mentioned one or two of them here. Secondly, Canada has a good reputation for peacekeeping, peacemaking. The blue helmets that are based in different parts of the world. I think at one point we had the largest number of peacekeeping missions in the world, a country that's relatively small in population, 35 million, but we're very proud of that peacekeeping tradition. One of our great prime ministers, Lester Pearson, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1956, in part for the peacekeeping mission to Egypt, which brought an end to the war that the French and the British were engaged with the Egyptians. And so those are specific on-the-ground initiatives where our men and women in uniform are trained to intervene in constructive ways. The second thing I would say, though, as a lawyer, is that it's so important that we develop the conditions within a society where peace and security and human rights, just by their existence, operate without threat, without the need of intervention of guns, etc. That elections are settled in the ballot box and not at the end of the barrel of a gun. Your Constitution, struck just as you were gaining independence, is a very important and precious document, especially the Charter on Rights and Responsibilities. To my great delight, Canadian constitutional lawyers work very closely with your lawyers in the crafting of that document. And the balance that is struck between law and order on the one hand and human rights and freedoms on the other in that document is something that I think is a marvel for constitutional lawyers around the world. So that those are important instruments, I think, in peace and security. And what I would say finally is it's so appropriate that nations like South Africa and Canada, which in some ways have had very different histories, but also have a very clear set of shared values. Peace, security, democratic institutions, human rights, the rule of law based in justice, work together and with other like-minded partners to bring those conditions to the so many other countries in the world that don't enjoy them.
Your Excellency, I'm sure we can keep going, but I think just for the sake of your time, we'll take two more questions and then we'll allow you to move on.
Young lady here.
Erin.
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm a student here at Wits. I have a bit of a two-part question. So it's no secret that South Africa's lost a fair amount of aid in terms of the UK and the US. In terms of your partnerships, and in saying that, in the past couple of years, Canada's aid towards South Africa and Africa in general has also declined. So when you speak about partnerships, I'm assuming you're speaking about further aid or partnerships towards further aid. And if I'm reading that correctly and understanding everything that you said, it looks like that's going to be channeled towards education. That's the first half, just to establish whether I understand that correctly. And then the second half is, you said that you viewed South Africa as a gateway or a hub into Africa. Would that mean that such partnerships would extend into the African Development Bank or the AU, or further to that?
Let me take the second question first. I would expect partnership and cooperation in those institutions, but many others that have to do with the development of the African continent over at least the next decade beyond, both public and private. With respect to banking, for example, I would love to see a healthier presence of Canadian financial institutions here and across Africa, because banking and financial institutions is something we do well. Like your country, our banking system withstood the global financial resolution very well. It's been ranked the #1 banking system in the world, and I think with good reason. So those kinds of involvements are very real, both for profit and not for profit. With respect to aid, I wouldn't agree that our aid has diminished. It certainly has changed in one or two pockets. Old-fashioned grants in aid has diminished, and that's in part because South Africa has become a middle-income country, and rightly or wrongly, we've chosen to concentrate that traditional kind of aid on the poorest countries in the world. That's not to deny that there isn't lots of poverty in South Africa, but as one does a matrix of where you put your dollars in one kind of basket, our choice has been the 20 or so poorest countries in the world. But the aid and the partnership and the mutual development, I think, is very substantial in so many others. I mentioned several today. Those two institutions of excellence, quite something that a government would put $20 million into an Institute for Mathematical Sciences here because a brilliant young man says it's important for me to do something at my home. That was Neil Turek's persuasion. It was the work of Peter and others who said, yeah, that's worth Canada being involved. The square kilometer telescope array, a selected number of countries are involved in that. It does not involve the largest country in the world, which does pretty good things in telescopes, biggest in terms of gross domestic product, that is. But how terrific that Canadians would say, yeah, this is a project that we'd like to be involved in. One, it's collaboration for greater science. Two, it's a focus on excellence here in Africa. And three, we actually get something out of it. What we get out of it is that intellectual capital exchange that I indicated, that we participate with some of the most talented minds in the world in astrophysicists. I could probably name another 20 or so examples of aid partnership that we think work very well. Yesterday noon we had lunch with officials from your Treasury Department and from the Economic Development Department of the West Cape Province. And we have had an 8 or 9 year history with them, with millions of dollars per year put into essentially the establishment of better public servants, better public services. They're a part of a group that essentially does value for money auditing. They go into troubled situations where governments are involved and they help to straighten them out and make them better. I think we have many of those kinds of, quote, aid already, and I expect we'll have many more, especially as we develop a better sense of where the most sharp priorities are and how especially we can bring public and private partnership interests together to focus on it. So last question here. Thank you. Let's take two, because that young man had his hand up and then this gentleman. So go to the back row and then right here.
Your Excellency, thank you for your fascinating remarks. I'm Saul Musk, and I'm also a student at this university. First of all, I think you'd be surprised by how many young South Africans, or how much young South Africans know about your country, only from the American cartoon South Park.
I thought you were going to say my lecture. I was like, holy, I was thinking this is going to be a great moment, but no, South Park. Okay, fine.
But my question I didn't learn from television, and it follows very nicely on from your previous answer. As you all know, the Canadian International Development Agency has been absorbed into your Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And that's been a move that's raised some eyebrows amongst African observers, particularly in light of comments by that minister, inferring that aid would be more closely aligned and linked with commercial interests in Canada, you know, with concerns of mining interests in particular, the mining sector in Canada. And so my question is, do you think, and does Canada feel, that aid should be independent from commercial interests? And either way, how can you assure Africans of the security and intentions of Canadian development aid?
Well, with respect to the last question, watch it with care, observe it, and be satisfied that it meets those standards. With respect to whether aid can be aligned with commercial interests, I think in some circumstances it can. It can be very helpful. We, 3 days ago, were at a diamond mine in Botswana, where sustainable development practices are very important. That mine will last for 15 years. What will happen when it leaves? A number of initiatives, in this case largely supported by the mine itself, but increasingly, I think, from other partnership stakeholders to try to ensure that community has a sustainable future beyond the mine. And so one project was microfinance for women in the town to develop their own businesses. The second was the rebuilding of a very old abattoir that is important to the cattle industry, so that one could have a slaughtering place for the cattle in that local region rather than shipping out to some distant location and develop a much more substantial export market. Until 2 years ago, I was the trustee of the MasterCard Foundation, which was set up by MasterCard, the commercial company, when it moved from being controlled by banks to a public company, and it put 10% of its initial public offering into a self-standing self-standing foundation. That is now worth $6.5 billion Canadian. That's a lot of money for a foundation whose focus is microfinance and youth education, with particular focus on Africa. It's done great things. One of the hopes I had on that is while we were independent of MasterCard Inc., the commercial organization, I did not want our foundation, to get too independent, because MasterCard is one of the great world's experts in the technology that is essential to modern financial institutions. Imagine trying to bank, as we did when I was a young man, with written checks, etc. You go and wait in line, put money out, put money in. The banking industry couldn't function that way. Information technology has revolutionized, and it's made it possible for us to make smaller and smaller loans, provide insurance, health, etc. in smaller quantities. And what you'd love to do is to have a not-for-profit organization like MasterCard Foundation come into a village, a very, very poor area, and lift the level of commerce and business activity so that all of a sudden it becomes attractive for profit-making institutions, which will compete with one another to keep the cost low and the service high, and you get a whole level of takeoff. So I think there is a place for government sponsored aid to move in with private sector practices, but to be sure that it works for sustainability and for the real interests of improving the human condition, it requires thoughtful people like you and others, and particularly the press, to look at it and say, is this working or not? And if it's not working, be sure it's changed. Last question here.
Thank you, Excellency. My name is Raphael. I work for the Department of Trade and Industry. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Johannesburg. My question is more in terms of the model, the economic model that Canada have put in place in order to address some of the issues that African countries have. One of the issues was before most of you intervention or most of your investment were more based in the mining as well as in the oil industry, and this is what we have noticed, even though many people are saying Africa is rising, but we see there's growth, like in Angola, 20%, and even the DRC where there's war, you can see it's 10% of growth. But when we check in reality, it's more, there's more poverty in the ground because more of the investment are in mining. So there's more interest in mining and in oil industry and even in downstream business such as agriculture and some of the business where there's wellness for individuals. That is one of the issues. How are you going to address this issue? Do you have any model? Do you want to change it in terms of WTO rules? Because we have also problems there with your regulations are nice in terms of trading, but underground there's some kind of politics because African people really cannot bring their product to some of your countries. So we see the threat of imports from your country, but in exchange, we only exchange minerals or petrols. So we have that problem. As we can see in South Africa, about 25% of people are not working, and this is because there's no a good model in terms of business assistance, even in terms of the skill development that you have said. It's more about the engineers and all this kind of skills, but we don't see you really coming down to the people and try to train them in terms of business, how they can trade, even able to bring some of their products in your country. Thank you.
Well, there are many different thoughts that occur to me when you raise that question, but I begin with the proposition that anybody that mines your resources must do so according to the rule of law of South Africa. And you want to be sure that your rule of law ensures that there is a return to all of the people in your country, beginning with how those resources are taxed and continuing with whether they properly protect the environment, whether they have human resource policies that actually train local people to do higher value jobs, whether they have a philosophy of sustainability, so that if it's a time-limited resource, such as a 15 or 20-year-old mine, there is a view of what will happen to that community afterwards. And that on that basis, the proposition goes forward. You're blessed to have natural resources. We're blessed to have natural resources in Canada. We have the second largest land mass in the world. And we've gone through periods where we have been concerned that we've been hewers of wood and drawers of water, that we've been extracting our resources and shipping them out with no value added. But that's a place where you put the challenge to the private sector to add that value, where you put programs in place to be sure that value is being added, and where you are granting licenses to any operation that is extracting those resources, that in fact it does so on your conditions and not their conditions. It's a wonderful book that I've been quoting a lot in the last few months. It's called Why Nations Fail. It's by James Robinson, a scholar at Harvard, and another colleague at MIT, and it's one that I'm particularly fond of because it's a product of the Global Economics program of the Canadian Institute of Advanced Research. And their thesis is a very simple one. It is those nations that are inclusive in their politics and economics thrive, and those which are extractive in their economics and politics begin to fail. And it's interesting, it's not exclusive, it's not inclusive and exclusive, 180-degree opposites. It's inclusive and extractive, 145-degree opposites. I'll just end with this story. Chancellor Merkel from Germany was with us 2 or 3 months ago, and we had a wonderful discussion. She's a professor of chemistry by background and is a very keen mind. I was trying to cross-examine her on whether the European Union, you know, that body that won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, 6 decades of peace in Europe after 1,000 years where hardly a decade went by without war. And she was trying to grill me on how this crazy quilt Canada worked. How could we work with so many different languages, cultures, religions, experiences, and build it into multiculturalism? So we kind of had 10 minutes for her and 10 minutes for me. And when I got my 10 minutes, we were speaking about the very kind of question you raised, including high unemployment rates. And I was quoting the book, Why Nations Fail. And her English was quite good, but when we got to this issue of what is inclusiveness, the positive qualities, and what is extractiveness, the negative qualities, she turned to her German colleagues and they began chatting in German, and I realized they'd come up with about 15 different synonyms for the word extractive. But all of them were negative, and that would be the point I would make. You want to be sure that when you have markets and capitalism working in your society, that it is not extractive, that it is inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for those very thoughtful remarks, and thank you all to the participants for your questions.